welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of many beautiful books. There is a new book in particular out this past September that we are here to talk about, but some old books as well. I'm looking forward to future books. We're here to talk about a whole career, and I am so excited for this conversation. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your new book, please?
Thank you so much, Jen. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Michelle Kadarusman. I'm actually originally from Australia and Indonesia. My third home is Canada, where I am right now. But my new story, Seabird, is actually set in what we call modern Indonesia now, but it's set in the 19th century Java. And it's based around a real person. Her name was Kartini, and she is the daughter of a noble family. So her father was regent, and at that time, in Java was part of the Dutch East Indies. Modern Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for hundreds of years. So she thought of herself as Javanese. There wasn't a concept of sort of modern Indonesia as we know it now. But Kartini was this incredibly bright young woman, young girl. In my book, we meet her when she's 12. And as the daughter of a regent, she was permitted to go to Dutch school. So she learned Dutch fluently. She was incredibly bright. She spoke 3 languages. She loved being at school. She loved learning. But when she turned 12, she was told she had to stay home. And she wasn't allowed to leave the compound of her home until she was chosen. Somebody was, it was arranged for her marriage. And this person was not chosen, but it was just deemed that you would stay home and until that time came that you were chosen as a wife. And she had watched her older sister go through this, and she loved learning. She looked around her and she couldn't believe that she didn't have the same opportunities as her brothers and also her European classmates. So the book begins there, and it's really about Kartini fighting for her freedom, for herself and for her sisters. And she would later become a feminist icon in Indonesia. In Indonesia today, there is a holiday celebrated every year on her birthday, Kartini Day. So she, even these hundreds of years later, this young woman, even though, what really amazes me about her was she had absolutely no power at all. She was kind of, she lived in a colonized situation, so her country was suppressed. She was also, suppressed because she was a girl, but she still had this voice that's carried throughout these generations over hundreds of years that still inspires girls today. So that's the subject, and you can tell I get very passionate about her. She's, and so Seabird is sort of a snapshot of when she was a sort of a tween, for the years that she was in seclusion until she was able to earn her freedom.
Such a fascinating and beautiful story, one that I only really knew the very bare outlines of. I was familiar with her as a figure, but not sort of like the contours of her life, and certainly not the all the letters that she wrote over the course of her life. So speaking of those letters, I'm really curious about your encounter with them. When you first encountered them, had you read them before you considered this book, or did you pursue them while researching this book?
A little bit of all of the above. I've always known about Kartini as a figure. I started to become really interested in her as a character, somebody I could write about. The letters that Fortunately, there has been a scholar who is in the university, Monash University in Melbourne, a professor who has translated all of her letters that were written in Dutch into English. So when I was able to get my hands on that text, I was really able to dig deeply into her correspondence and really hear her voice. So that's felt really, even though I'd known about her, then I really felt like I sort of knew her on a different level. And because I write for middle grade, most of her letters that are published are sort of from when she's an older teenager, around 19 until her early 20s. So when I was sort of reading through this text, there was something that came up that when she makes a reference to letters that she wrote to a schoolmate during this time of seclusion where I set the book. She mentions how important it was that when she wrote letters to her friend Leslie Klassen. Um, so that would have been when she was about 12, 13. And I was like, oh, that's something from my age group. And sadly, those letters were lost to history. So we don't have them. But that's when I really imagined, well, I would love to sort of fill that gap and reimagine what that correspondence would have been. So that was really my jumping off point to sort of getting into that character. But, it's really for the listeners who don't know that, her an archive of her letters, her real letters, were sadly she died in her sort of mid-20s, very, very young, but she had written to so many European friends, and she was just so she was she was so enlightened about so many deep subjects at the time, and it was so interesting to have a voice from the colonies, because it was perceived like how could she be so bright and intelligent, and and so she really gave a voice. So this archive of letters was published by her friends after she had died. That was in 1912, and this archive of letters has never been out of print. It's remained in print in certain formats, one or the other, since then. So it really truly is her voice that is still out in the world. And I just, for my readers, I just thought it would be very cool to sort of have an insight into this young girl, who actually, managed to stir a whole nation with her own words. And, I think we can all feel, but especially when you're young, you feel like you don't have any agency or power in your life. But at least with Kartini's voice, we can say that that's not true. You can, one voice can have an incredible impact.
Absolutely. And what an incredible voice. It was so fascinating to encounter her ideas and the way that the correspondences shaped the formation of her ideas, and her interactions with the world. Was that a very different process of character development for you? I imagine, encountering the voice first and then capturing her on the page must be so different from when you are, thinking up a fictional character and sort of inventing their voice as they go. Does that make sense? Or
No, totally. And it was something completely different for me. I've never done historical fiction before. I've never written about a real subject before. And in a way it felt kind of constraining in some ways. I couldn't, I certainly sort of had the framework I needed to, write within. And this is the first book where I've spent far more time researching and reading about than the actual writing. The actual research was sort of much more work than, didn't all end up on the page, but it was fascinating journey for me, and I really enjoyed doing it. I think I wouldn't say I wouldn't go back to doing historical fiction about a real subject, but I'm happy to have a break from, and to sort of go back to my more normal writing of fiction, which is just like completely my imagination.
So one thing I think that hit particularly that was very resonant for me about this novel is just the way that, isolation or seclusion, even when not chosen, can just spur a sort of like inner development or transformation. And I think especially in the wake of the pandemic, where we were all inside for so long and so many of us had our lives so changed under less constrained stressful circumstances even. But I'm curious about, how you see the part of her journey that you have sort of, let's see, imagined backward from the letters that do exist. What were the ideas and the themes in particular that you wanted to communicate to young readers, perhaps encountering her as a historical figure for the first time?
First and foremost, it was what I touched on earlier, that it is, no matter what, no matter how powerless you feel, that you can, just purely by writing down your truth, and standing up for your truth. And that can be in a really small way, just by writing to your friend and telling them how you feel. Um, I think it's a very powerful thing. And, essentially, this is a story about a young girl looking around her and seeing a great power imbalance, whether it was one country ruling another, or, a brother being favored over a sister, or even even classes within one culture being, Kartini was from a noble family, and there was certainly prejudice that they had also against, their servants and people in the village. So looking around her, she was able to sort of voice the unfairness of it all. And, I think as middle grade readers, especially, it's a beautiful time, where, middle grade, that age where we're looking out at the world and still really feeling like we can change the world. Very idealistic. Things are much more black and white, but most importantly, we still have this great hope that we can change the world. I think as we move into adolescence, we sort of maybe become more internalized and sort of don't look outwardly at the world so much. But the middle grade is this beautiful time where I feel like, which is my readers, and I love writing for this age group for this reason, that we can make a difference. So, when I set out to write it, that's the main theme that I wanted to sort of get out to the readers. Meanwhile, I mean, I think there's not a lot of books that are set during colonized times. Most people don't even realize that Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch for hundreds of years. So, that I also thought that would be interesting, to sort of give that. And I try not to be too weighed down with all the factual stuff, because these are very, very heavy and complex subjects. Colonization, patriarchy, subjugation of girls. I mean, these are, very big, heavy subjects, but like Kartini's real voice, there is a lightness and there is a humor and there is just this hopefulness. So I thought it would just be really interesting to be able to introduce those subjects with that lightness. And, the real sisterhood that she has with her own sisters and her mothers and family. All of my books tend to always, no matter what, I think they always seem to flow back to those same themes of friendships and family and self-empowerment. Sort of no matter where the book is set, that seems to sort of be the river that flows through my books.
That's lovely. And I love your point about sort of the the easier inclination towards hopefulness of middle grade readers. And do you think that also has anything to do with empathy? I feel like young readers are perhaps also more empathetic readers than not even maybe teen readers, but adult readers for sure. And I think maybe that like creates a sort of, I don't know, a ease of connection with people experiencing such different things in books.
Yeah, I know for sure. And I think, as a middle grade reader, you haven't experienced a lot in your life. And reading, it's real opportunity to do that, to, experience what it's like to live for like somebody who on a different country, a different culture, a different language, to sort of have some insight into that. And naturally, the empathy arrives from things that we lived and know. So the more reading, obviously, I feel in diverse quality diverse books, for this age group is so pivotal in developing that empathy. I think, as early as possible, ideally.
Absolutely. With that in mind, I'd love to talk for a little bit about one of your older books. I also read Music for Tigers for this interview, which I absolutely loved because it deals with one of my favorite animals on the planet, the Tasmanian Tasmanian tiger. So could you talk a little bit about the inception point for that story?
Happy to talk about Music for Tigers, and thank you for reading two of my books. And so, Music for Tigers is set in contemporary times, and it's set in the island of Tasmania in Australia. And I grew up in Australia. I grew up in Melbourne. And even for Australians, Tasmania is kind of remote, and in Tasmania, the Tarkine temperate rainforest is remote even for Tasmanians. So I kind of set the book in the most remote place possible. But it centers around the animal, the Tasmanian tiger, as you mentioned, which was actually a marsupial, was called a thylacine. Now, the thylacine sadly became extinct. It was officially declared extinct, I think, around the 1950s. The last known captive thylacine died in captivity in the 1930s. Sadly, when settlers arrived to Australia, they put a bounty on the head of the thylacine because they thought that they brought over their livestock and they thought the thylacine was killing off their livestock. It wasn't. It was this terrible error. They put a bounty on its head, and within I don't know how many decades, I do know, I did write the book, I can't recall, the thylacine had become extinct. So it's something, that it's this horrible thing that, happened, that a whole species that had been around for, thousands of years, then was wiped out in such a short period of time. But something still occurs to this day, that in Tasmania, people still swear that they see them. So that there's this large contingent of people who really believe that they still exist. Now, they're very specific looking animal. They kind of look like more like a wild dog than what you would imagine a marsupial to look like. But they had stripes on their back, which is why they were called tigers, because of the stripes. And so if you see one and you read all these accounts of people being absolutely positive, because it doesn't really look like anything else. So that, and growing up, knowing about the Tasmanian tiger and the loss of the Tasmanian tiger, and also with this kind of mystery about whether they are or aren't, there's been expeditions that have been launched. There's been, big money prizes, awarded to anyone who can find any, verification of their existence. There's, some grainy photos that some people have taken. There's some paw prints but nothing has been actually verified. So that's where I start the story. And it's about a Canadian girl who goes over to Tasmania. Her mother is Australian, and her family have this bush camp in the Tarkine, the remote Tarkine. And she finds out that for generations, her family have been secretly stewards of critically endangered and thought to be extinct animals. And one of them, of course, is the thylacine. And Louisa, who is the character in the novel, she's a violinist, and she ends up and she's not really a nature person. She doesn't really want to be in the bush. She'd prefer to be back in Toronto, practicing for, to get into the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. But she's been sort of thrown into this situation, but she finds that her violin music somehow is helping to lure this one thylacine that they need to get back to safety. So that's the setup. And it really is a love letter that I wrote to the Australian bush. It's a beautiful place in the world. And I went to that rainforest in the Tarkine in Tasmania to research the book, and it is remarkable. And you really can believe when you're there that this thought to be extinct animal might be roaming around somewhere, because it is so raw and untouched, and really a magical place.
Wow. So fascinating. And, it is such a striking animal. I've seen, I guess like the one or two grainy photos that still exist of them, and they are very uncanny valley. Like they look like they exist between several animals, or like
True, I know. They look like a made-up animal. That's
yeah,
right.
like you'd find them in a medieval bestiary. Um, but I really appreciated, reading these books together that obviously you have a totally different setting in time and place, but you're dealing with so many different themes. And especially, I think, shedding a light on a totally different consequence of colonialism than you explore in Cartini. I mean, in Seabird, I'm sorry.
No,
Um,
that's no. I for the longest time I called the book Cartini as
yeah.
well, and but it's true. And I hadn't done a through line to those two themes in the book. So yes, thank you for. Obviously, it's something that goes on sort of subconsciously in my head.
Um, I'd love to talk a little bit about Louisa, shaping her as a character, and especially her interactions with Colin, who I absolutely adored. You're really good at capturing, in a very realistic way, the way that young people talk to each other, which is not quite the way that like adult conversations flow. So can you talk about like, yeah, capturing her voice and sort of the way that she moves through the world as a young person? That's a huge question, but
No, I think Louisa is. I wanted to put a character in a situation that she didn't really want to be in, and she's also, it is a coming of age story in that she's learning a lot about herself. Um, she meets a friend. She becomes a friend with Colin, who's neurodivergent, which helps her understand some things about herself as well. That she's able to sort of look more inwardly at herself and understand some of the things that she's struggling with, and it's actually Colin who's able to help her with that, and she's able to sort of look at herself as what kind of friend she is, and she's able to look at herself in a way that she's never had to before. And that's why I was interested in putting her in a situation where she wasn't comfortable, because I think we know that there's no real, no mud, no mud, no lotus, right? Like we need to go through some difficulties in which to have this emotional growth. And this was sort of a very extreme way of doing it with this character, was to really take her out of her environment and plop her somewhere. And it does take a little while, but allow her to learn and grow and thrive and sort of come out the other side, having gained so much knowledge about herself, but also so much more appreciation through the knowledge of her family, and also of the natural world. She's things that she'd never thought of before. And, as young people, especially someone like Louisa, who is very singularly focused on her violin, doesn't really, she's just focused on that. And she's, she, after this story, she's really has this deep appreciation for the things that are immediately around her that she hasn't sort of paid that much attention to.
Yeah, I think if you take both books together, you get some really interesting insights and observations about the way that like young people explore their inner worlds and their outer worlds and how those things inform each other. Like it's about these young people living in very complex worlds with like complex issues. Yeah, they're really lovely, and it was such a joy to read them in close succession. I always end my interviews with a question about like what is on your horizon. But I hear that we might see some of these characters again, perhaps.
Well, I know. I usually am so used to saying, "Oh, I've never written a sequel to one of my books." But Music for Tigers, I have started to write a sequel for Music for Tigers, as it happens. So I'm so happy we talked about it, and because there is something incredible happening right now in the scientific world, and that is there's a de-extinction project happening in the University of Melbourne right now. There's an incredible amount